A newly released report suggests that U.S. weapons provided to Israel have been used in a way that systematically disregards the principles of international law. The unabated supply of U.S. arms to Israel, the report's authors argue, could be in violation of a new White House memorandum known as the National Security Memo 20, or NSM 20. The memo, released in February, requires recipients of U.S. foreign assistance to provide written assurances that they will comply with U.S. and international law and not impede U.S. efforts to provide humanitarian assistance. But after months of Israel's actions in Gaza, from striking refugee camps and family homes to killing more than 200 humanitarian aid workers, the authors argue that there is mounting evidence to suggest that U.S. arms are being used in ways that contravene international law. Joining us to discuss this are two of the authors of the report. Noura Erakat is a human rights lawyer and professor at Rutgers University, and Josh Paul is a former senior official at the U.S. Department of State who resigned this past October in protest of increased U.S. arms sales to Israel. He's now a non-resident fellow at Democracy for the Arab World Now. I want to thank you both for joining me. Noura, I'm going to start with you. Can you share some findings of the report, some key findings, specifically what evidence you found that indicates that U.S. arms sales to Israel could be in violation of U.S. law and international law, particularly the ones discussed in Biden's memo?
Absolutely. I want to emphasize, Mark, that National Security Memorandum number 20 isn't anything new, but actually lifts pre-existing laws that have not been enforced as they should have. And it includes international humanitarian law. Understanding very well that international humanitarian law is often contested and can be a slippery terrain, 2/3 of our report focuses on U.S. law alone, on civil harm mitigation and U.S. military best practices, as well as 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act. And then when we're looking at IHL, humanitarian law, we're looking at a customary international law that is less contested. Based on that framework, we found things that were really striking, right? That included, we document 16 incidents that are credible, that are compelling, that are undeniable. 11 out of those 16 incidents, there wasn't even a target that Israel said that it was trying to attack.
You say incidents of the U.S.
U.S. provided weapons. So we're focusing specifically on those instances where Israel used U.S. provided weapons. So we take thousands of lines of data. And from that, we're looking in which of these instances are there credible violations of law, and then in those instances, which of those are used by, are supplied by U.S. weapons, and then we evaluate them.
Wow, and you found 16.
Well, we found far more than 16. We decided to focus on 16 to provide an analysis for them, including included an 18-page annex for the White House to use. The objective here is that the Departments of State and Defense are supposed to write their own report and then submit that to Congress in order to trigger enforcement mechanisms, which we hope will result in the cessation of arms transfers to Israel, right? Now, here what we're providing is enough for the Department of State and Defense to submit this report if they wanted to. What I was saying about the 16 incidents that we scrutinize in detail is, of them, 11 out of the 16, there isn't even a target, which really disembowels the argument about human shields. And that's before we get into this misinterpretation of how we evaluated it in international law and how Israel has evaluated it in this moment. 11 out of the 16, there isn't even a military target. Half of those incidents are residents
What were the targets?
in their homes.
The reason I ask is because an Israeli representative would probably say those homes had a Hamas combatant in there, or there was some kind of military action going on. So when you say it wasn't a military target, what do we mean by that, for clarity?
So first I'm going to say in response, first to say that in these instances, they didn't even say there was a target inside. Nor did they, when they were asked for comment, provide justification. So this is blatant. We're giving the U.S. government the lowest hanging fruit, the least controversial cases where there isn't going to be that back and forth exchange.
Gotcha.
That's number one. On the number two, saying that there's a Hamas combatant inside, for example, isn't enough. That isn't the beginning and the end of the analysis. Both in U.S. law and in international law, Israel, that if somebody was using human shields illegally, that doesn't absolve Israel of its responsibility to protect civilians and to reduce harm.
Gotcha. Josh, Biden's memorandum requires that countries receiving military aid have to provide credible and reliable assurances that they're using this aid in compliance with U.S. law and international law. The U.S. says that the Israeli government has provided them with these assurances. But for weeks now, groups like Oxfam, Human Rights Watch, and others, not to mention dozens of members of Congress, have written to the Biden administration. They've disputed the credibility of Israel's claims. So how is the U.S. evaluating the credibility of Israel's assurances? Like, is there transparency even here on how we assess that?
Well, so that's the question, Mark. I think the answer is there's none so blind as those who will not see. We have seen a consistent pattern from the administration of denying from the podiums at the Departments of State, at Defense, at the White House, that there have been any violations of international humanitarian law by the government of Israel, in spite of, massive reporting, including our own report here, which is in ways a meta-analysis, as Noura mentioned, of thousands of other reports and hundreds of other lines of data that have been contributed by both international NGOs and by aid organizations on the ground. The problem is that the administration to date has not actually asked its own lawyers to take a look at these allegations to come to determinations of fact regarding whether there have been violations of international humanitarian law. There was a letter from members of Congress just last week urging them to do so, urging them as well to ask the intelligence community for its assessments. Our understanding is that to date, the administration has simply not asked those whose opinions would be binding upon it, such as lawyers, as to whether these violations are happening. It is our hope that by providing the level of detail contained in this report, that the administration will have to, when it reports to Congress by May 8th, as it is required to do, at least acknowledge the facts, at least come to terms with some of these issues and some of these incidents. I would be concerned that what we will see instead is a continuation of the pattern in which they have simply dodged the question.
Help me understand something. After gathering all the evidence in your report, in your estimation, why is the Biden administration failing to act in accordance with a policy that was signed by the president himself, and not that long ago, less than 3 months ago, right, as a directive to his own government? Why introduce a directive if you're never intending to implement it?
So I think the answer here in part is that we have to wait and see. The report is coming from the administration to Congress by May 8th, and I don't want to prejudge it. Let's hope, let's assume, our effort here is really a good faith effort to try and inform the administration's reporting so that when they do follow the directives of NSM 20 and report to Congress, they will do so in a manner that is honest, factual, and fulsome.
By that premise, then, we would have to presume that to date, they simply are unaware that they're in violation of this policy, and then this report will make them aware.
So this is a hook through which that they can report fulsomely on what they should know, what we have certainly told them about. They absolutely should have all the information at their hands and should have had for 6 months now.
That's my point, but you're right.
Right. I mean, when I left the State Department in October, this was known within the State Department that there were violations of human rights happening, that there were violations of international law happening. That's why I left.
But how are people responding? If you knew and everyone knew, you left, the other people didn't leave. What's the tenor? How are people responding?
So a lot of people are. So first of all, a number of people have left quietly and not made a public statement in doing so. There are a lot of people within the US government who are really struggling right now with what is being done by the government at their hands in their name. I think everyone has to make their own personal decision based on, their need for health care. Health insurance in this country comes with the job. If you have a family, that's a consideration. How closely related the work you are doing is to the atrocities being carried out with the weapons we are providing is another question. But for sure, there are many people who know that what we are doing is wrong and who are really struggling with it.
Noura, according to a new report commissioned by the United Nations, Israel has yet to provide any evidence to substantiate its claims that a number of UNRWA employees are members of terrorist organizations. When Israel made these accusations, the U.S. was quick to cut much-needed funding to UNRWA, despite the fact that it plays an indispensable role in providing humanitarian assistance to Gazans. In the meantime, the U.S. has continued to fund Israel's military, despite the fact that there's tremendous evidence of human rights violations. What do you make of this stark contrast between the administration's response to UNRWA versus how they're regarding the Israeli military?
I think let's take what's evidence in the pattern over many, many decades, not just in the past 6 months or almost 7 months now, which is that there is both a deference to Israel and what Israel says without an adequate amount of scrutiny, and there is also a lack of even acknowledgement and respect for what Palestinians are saying. I think one of the things that's happening here when we talk about the dehumanization of Palestinians is their racialization that even makes their testimony less credible, so that folks who hear them, perhaps in the State Department, just aren't taking them as seriously unless somebody else is speaking for them. So I think that's first and foremost. The second is that this should tell us, right, that there is an abject problem with scrutiny of Israel and the information that they're providing, and that there isn't enough scrutiny in what they're providing in their prevention of access to humanitarian aid. We document in the report, this is a violation of 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act. We're not even talking about under international law, you cannot starve communities. We're basically saying the U.S. shall not provide arms to a situation where they are also trying to get, provide a humanitarian corridor and access to food. Well, Bezalel Smotrich told the U.S. that we will not allow some $1.5 million worth of aid that you're trying to bring into Gaza because it's going to be distributed to UNRWA. And the U.S. sat on their hands and started dropping food from the sky. And so we know that the administration knows something. ProPublica has just published a report that there is enough and considerable internal dissent within state and before Secretary of State Antony Blinken. We also know that the administration is now toying with the idea of applying sanctions to the Netzach Yehuda battalion in the West Bank for the killing of Omar Assad, the 78-year-old Palestinian man who was killed even before October 7th. So we understand that the administration is feeling the heat.
Yeah.
From everywhere, but we also think that that's a little bit too late and far too little given what we're looking at.
Let me pick up on that. In December, after reviewing allegations that several Israeli security units had committed grave human rights violations, a special State Department panel known as the Israel Lehi Vetting Forum recommended that Secretary Blinken disqualify these units from receiving U.S. aid. 4 months later, Secretary of State Blinken has finally addressed the recommendations, and he stated to the press the results of the investigation will be made public in just a few days. You worked at the State Department for years. What would be the significance if he does decide to sanction them?
So not only did I work at the State Department for several years, but I sat as a member of the Israel Lehi Vetting Forum for several years. And the allegations we are talking about now are allegations that have been sitting for years. These date back to 2022, or even many years earlier. There had always been an effort to elevate these concerns, to put a memo to the Secretary, which is, by the way, a requirement only for Israel. There's no other country for which we need to seek the Secretary's approval before embarking.
Literally no other country.
No other country where a unit becomes ineligible for assistance under the Lehi law, and we have to ask the Secretary to sign off on that. So the very fact that it is the Secretary making this decision demonstrates the double standard when it comes to Israel. But for years we'd been asking the department to move forward on these sorts of allegations, and for years could never get them past the political level. I think there has always been broad agreement within the experts within the State Department that these abuses are happening, that they deserve to be cut off under the Lehi law from U.S. grant assistance. But getting anyone who was in a politically appointed job or a Senate-confirmed job to actually do what was necessary to move that paperwork to the Secretary, at least prior to the time I left, never happened. I think it's a good sign in some ways that there has been at least a memo going forward. I think it's important to note, first of all, that this Lehi vetting or this Lehi restriction only applies to US-funded assistance. So the same units that will not be eligible if the Secretary makes those determinations for grant assistance can still turn around with their own money and buy anything they like from the US in terms of weapons. This is a very narrow restriction. At the same time, it all relates to things that happened before the current conflict in Gaza. So on the one hand, the US can say, look, we are taking steps. On the other hand, it can continue the flow of arms that we know are creating so much suffering in Gaza, killing so many civilians in Gaza, unimpeded.
And what you just described is the best case scenario where the sanctions happen and then there's a back way. Do you anticipate that the sanctions are going to happen?
So it seems like at this point that there will be at least one unit, Netzach Yehuda, as Noura mentioned, for which the sanctions or the prohibitions on assistance are brought forward. There were at least 5 other units we were looking at in my time in the State Department that should be similarly eligible for prescriptions under Lehi. We will see what the Secretary decides.
And that creates a bit of a more complicated problem for the White House. No, I mean, it's one thing to dismiss outside forces, but when your own State Department issues a sanction, I mean, you got to listen. You got to at least respond differently, no?
Well, right. I mean, so again, I think part of this is just a matter of public diplomacy. This allows the Secretary of State to say that he's doing something. It allows him to point at the Israeli government, who are jumping up and down and saying, how dare we? And say, look, we are really turning the screw here. But in fact, again, the weapons continue to flow on a daily basis to the IDF for use in Gaza. So, this is an unprecedented step. I'm not sure how important a step it is.
Prior to the adoption of Biden's memorandum, there already were laws in place that suspend or at least restrict arms transfers to human rights violators. In fact, you stated, Josh, that if these laws had been applied effectively in Israel, like in other countries, we, quote, wouldn't have the IDF filming TikToks of their war crimes now because we have contributed to a culture of impunity. I'll ask you, Noura. I mean, what makes you think the introduction of this memorandum would lead to something different if you do?
Well, as Josh stated, we are now, over 200 days of this campaign, some 35,000 Palestinians killed, 1.9 million internally displaced, 1.4 million of them in the only standing city left in Rafah, and Israel is planning to invade. Right? We have tried almost everything. We have, pulled the levers on national courts, at the ICC, at the ICJ, even against the Biden administration within U.S. courts. This is another opportunity, as Josh said, it is a hook to use U.S. law in order to apply more pressure and to add to the mounting voices. I mean, the fact that 40 Democrats sent a letter, including Nancy Pelosi, to Biden calling for a halt in arms transfers. More significant than that, they're basically saying, listen to your experts. There are experts who are telling us what is happening on the ground, is giving us an indication that there's an intransigence on the inside, almost a stubbornness, right, to continue at all costs, even at the cost of his 2024 elections, right? But we are part of this effort to, make that evidence indisputable and make that choice even harder.
The U.S., of course, isn't alone in this unyielding support of Israel. Germany, second only to the U.S. in providing arms to Israel, accounted for roughly 30% of Israel's arms imports between 2019 and 2023, and it's repeatedly defended Israel. Even after the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, ruled that it was plausible that Israel was committing genocide in Gaza. In fact, Nicaragua brought forward a case against Germany at the World Court in March, accusing the country of being complicit in genocide. Why? Because they were heavily arming Israel. Do you think countries like the U.S., countries like Germany, are going to be held accountable for their complicity?
We have to try. We are going to try. I mean, the thing on genocide, right, that there's no statute of limitations. And so when the balance of power shifts and these countries do not have the same amount of impunity that they now benefit from, I do think that they will be held to account at any stage. I mean, think about other accused of atrocities. And more significantly, it's actually creating a record that they are a minority amongst a majority, millions and millions across the globe, where they actually are trying to do by coercive force in the absence of any kind of moral argument, right, to achieve only what can be achieved by crushing force, what now is buoying this movement, which is truth, the nobility of a cause, commitment to justice. And so, the other thing to emphasize here by that quote is that we put a lot of emphasis on a few states and what they're doing, and yet there are 194 states that can be imposing sanctions, cutting off diplomatic relations, boycotting Israel. And we saw a number of other states actually do that in ending their military transfers, including Japan, including Colombia, including Canada, as we're about to see. And we've also seen a cutting of diplomatic aid, which is to say everybody has a role to play. And it empowers people to think about what is the role they should play.
Are there other legal instruments that could be used against the United States if it continues to arm Israel?
So I know from colleagues inside the department that there are an increasing number of people who are declining to be a part of this because precisely they are afraid of being on holiday in Italy one day and having a knock on the door and saying the ICC would like to talk to you. That does have an impact. And what I would say to the colleagues who are not stepping back from this work is that they should be thinking about that as well. Because there is some real liability here, both for government officials who are authorizing the transfer of weapons and for those in the defense industry who are, building the arms that are being used. And I think, any level of due diligence would tell them that the arms they are making will be used to kill thousands of civilians. there are also claims that are going to be made and that are being made in domestic courts both around the country, but also internationally. You know, there are a lot of crimes here that have universal jurisdiction, and the fact that the US justice system may or may not be an effective tool in this case does not mean that there will not be justice systems in Europe or in Latin America, or for that matter in Africa, where such cases cannot be brought. And, you know, once those are, then those charges, you know, are significant and will have an impact on people.
You know, this includes a case that was filed against Israeli President Isaac Herzog upon his disembarkment in Davos, for example. So we've already seen a precedent being set. We see similar commitment to bring those cases in South Africa as well as in the UK by independent lawyers. And so what we see now is going to be the beginning of something that will be ongoing.
Help me understand the material, physical stakes of maintaining the status quo. And I say that because after a months-long struggle, the U.S. Congress has just approved $26 billion in aid, emergency assistance, technically I think it's called, to Israel, which includes roughly $15 billion in military aid. You mentioned the airstrikes in Rafah. There's a wider escalation of violence in the region right now. Over the last 3 weeks, we've seen it, you know, in southern Lebanon, we've seen it in Syria, we've seen it in Iran. What are the implications for the U.S. continuing to offer military aid to Israel?
I mean, I would say for my part that, you know, the longer this goes on, first of all, as you've identified, the greater the risks of regional escalation. If it is not, you know, with the US in Yemen, if it is not with Israel and Iran, it will be with Israel and Lebanon. And, you know, the stakes just continue to increase, including the perils to humanity and the suffering of people in the region. At the same time, it's clear that both the US and Israel are digging themselves into a deeper hole every day this goes on. What is happening is not making Israel any more secure, and what is happening is deeply disadvantaging the US, coming at immense cost to our relations in the region and our credibility around the world.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I'll say is that, you know, Israel has lost the grounds on the grounds of morality and including the grounds of justice. In terms of the narrative power of this discussion, it's clear that Palestinians have prevailed in getting their story across, and it's only being squashed from the top down, but not from the bottom up, which means that it's a matter of time. When these policies change. The generation right now in front of us, those who are, you know, encamping in their universities, who are not going to their commencement, who are bearing risk of expulsion and suspension, are basically the leaders of tomorrow. Yeah. And when they lead us, this has marked a sea change, and we hope that, you know, by providing this evidence, we're only sharing, right, more on the record that there were some of us who have been saying this the entire time. The U.S., you know, is revealing itself as not even governing democratically, when 80% of the registered Democrats are opposed, you know, to this ongoing campaign and have demanded a ceasefire, and the Democratic leadership, whether they be in Congress or in the executive, who are not even listening to them, right? They demonstrate that there's also a crisis in democracy in this moment.
I'm glad you mentioned Congress for a moment, because we've actually seen maybe the first time an opening question by members of Congress, right? Should we be funding Israel? Is there a meaningful shift in Washington right now?
Is it meaningful? I think that's a big question. Are we seeing many shifts? Obviously. We've seen an insurgency within the Democratic Party, but they're obviously a minority, and the same body censored the one Palestinian American member of Congress for saying from the river to the sea, right? Some invocation of that, while they failed to say anything to their own fellow members who have called for a dropping of an atomic bomb on the Gaza Strip, or who have called to kill off all Palestinian children. Not only is this representative of a blatant, you know, dehumanization and racism that afflicts, you know, the logic within Congress, but it's also telling us that, you know, what does meaningful change look like at the top? You know, I think we need to think about U.S. Congress as being, you know, the role that it plays as it has in the past. It will probably be the last domino to fall in the shifts that the U.S. makes, similar to the way that it was the last domino to fall in the movement against apartheid in South Africa. You know, the Reagan administration was the last to hop on that train. And so I think that we're going to see this shift continue to move until we push down that final domino.
Josh, when you resigned from the State Department in October, as you mentioned, you stated in a public letter that Israel's actions in Gaza and the unbridled support that it receives from the United States, quote, is not in the long-term American interest. What do you mean by that?
Well, no, that's exactly right. And I think we see that. We've existed in the last 30 years in this moment of American hegemony where we can do a lot of dumb things around the world and not pay a cost for them. That moment is going, if it is not already gone. We are in an era of strategic competition where there is a cost attached to our support to Israel, and we are paying that cost every day in terms of our ability to, for example, rally partners to support Ukraine, in terms of our credibility at the United Nations. I think that there is a deep cost here, and what is even more concerning is, this country has worked for generations in the post-Cold War era to build an international system, and that is an international system that protects us all with its laws, with its norms. We are now the ones tearing it apart to protect Israel and to allow Israel to continue its actions and its violations of that international law. That, at the end of the day, will come back to bite all of us.
Josh, Paul, Noura Erakat, thank you so much for sharing your report with us, and thank you for talking to us on UpFront.